Our reading today will be from Mark chapter 16, verses 1 to 8. When the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. And they were saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" And looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back. It was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. And he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He's not here. See the place where they laid him? But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he's going before you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid.
So, I really, really need you to have in front of you that passage open, if possible. You're free to not do that, but you'll find it really helpful to be able to see those words the whole time, and you'll see why. So don't switch off, but get a Bible open. And that reading was taken from the ESV translation. I don't know if you've all got access to that, but find it on your phone, or if possible, find it on paper, and you'll see why. It's much more helpful. I don't know what you come to church expecting. I certainly don't know what you come to church expecting from during the sermon. I know that some people come to church for the sermon as the chance to kind of shut their eyes and catch up on their missed sleep from Saturday night. You're free to do so. I'd suggest that you don't. But do you expect to hear anything new? Chances are you won't hear anything new most times you come to church. Chances are you'll hear something you've heard before. And I don't know how you feel about that, whether you're like, just be nice to hear something new, wouldn't it? Well, I want to suggest to you today that if you hear the same thing again and again and again, it can be an increasingly good thing. I'm just going to read you some words that are not from the Bible, and I just want to kind of see if there's a flicker of recognition on your faces as I read these words. I'm sure it'll mean something to somebody here at least. When Mr. Bilbo Baggins of Bag End announced that he would be celebrating his 111st birthday with a party of special magnificence, there was much talk and excitement in Hobbiton. I saw at least a couple of smiles, so at least some people here know what I'm talking about. Anybody care to say what I've just read? Bit of audience participation. Thank you. The Lord of the Rings. It's my favorite book. It's a big one. It took me a while to get into it, but once I got into reading The Lord of the Rings, it became a book that I would reread every 4 or 5 years. And so I've read it a number of times in my life, and I know the ending. I know exactly how it happens, and I'm really sorry to spoil the ending for you if you don't know it, but Frodo destroys the ring and Middle-earth is saved. What is the point of reading that story again? I'm going to read it again probably in the next 8 to 12 months because I'm due, and I know what's going to happen. I know how it starts. I've just read you the beginning, and I know how it ends. And actually, when I get to the ending, and I promise this is true, this is not an exaggeration, when I get to the end of this book, and it's a big one, if you've watched the films, which, by the way, are not as good as the books, there's 12 hours of film if you watch the extended edition. It's a big story. But I get to the end of it, and I promise you this is true, I go, Tolkien, why did you stop? Keep writing. I'm so into it. I love the story, and I don't want him to finish. Try another one. This is a little bit more risky. I wonder if there's a flicker of recognition. We're going on a bear hunt. Does anyone know the next line? we're going to catch a big one. Someone knows it. The last time I talked about this book in a church, it was a church with a lot of children, and everybody was laughing because they know the story. We're going on a bear hunt. We're going to catch a big one. What a beautiful day. I probably read that story to my kids 300 or 400 times, and I never got bored of it. Lord of the Rings, I'm probably on 5 or 6, not bored of that yet. Why is that, though? Why can you get into a good book again and again and not get bored, if that has ever been your experience? And I hope for at least some of you, you've had the experience of reading a good book and wanting to come back to it. Why does that happen? Why is it okay to not always need to move on to a new story? Well, there are lots and lots of reasons, but at least one of the reasons is that if it's a good book, if it's a good story, it grabs you and you want to be in that story. So when I'm traveling through Middle-earth with Frodo and Sam and his other 7 companions, I'm with them. I'm seeing the trees, I'm feeling the hunger, I'm sensing the danger. And you're in the story. And even on the bear hunt, 500 or 600 times with my toddler children, as they go through the long grass and the sticky mud and the scary forest, I'm with them on that story. And I know how it's going to end, but when I get to the end, I'm still ready to go back to the beginning because it's a good story. I hope you've had that experience. And stories and books are like that. You could probably think of your own favorite opening line or favorite ending, and you hear it and you're just transported back to that experience of experiencing that story. Well, looking at Mark's gospel, the verses that were read were the end. And unlike Lord of the Rings, when I read the end of Mark's gospel, verses 1 to 8, I don't have that experience that I have with Lord of the Rings of thinking, keep going. I read the ending and I think, that's a pretty poor ending. I don't know how you felt as you were reading it. I don't know how you felt as you were listening to it. I don't know if you've ever read it before. Mark's gospel tends not to get so much press in church sermons for whatever reason. And the ending is just a bit weird. Let's just be honest. Let's face up to what we've just read, what we've just heard. It's a pretty anticlimactic ending. And I want you to feel that. What kind of things did you see as an anticlimax? Well, first of all, the women turn up, and they don't really know what's going to happen. I mean, credit to them for turning up. The men haven't even bothered. Did you notice that? The men are nowhere in the scene. So credit to the women for turning up and wanting to do a good thing. But they're confused as they go there, and they're even more confused as they leave. Did you notice? Trembling and astonishment has seized them. And they've just been given this instruction by, I guess, some kind of angel figure, this young man dressed in a white robe. You'd think they'd pay attention, but they don't. They're like, we're out of here. And they don't do what they're told. And that's where it ends. You can see in our Bibles, probably in your version, there are other words from verse 9. Just discount that, at least for the moment. The ending of the gospel really is verse 8, and you'll see why in a few moments. There's other anticlimax. Do you see verse 7? Go, tell his disciples and Peter. Peter's probably the guy that wrote this gospel, or the guy that kind of oversaw the writing of this gospel. And in his own account of his relationship with Jesus, he's like, I wasn't even there. I didn't even count as a disciple. This angel says, go and tell the disciples. Oh yeah, and Peter, who's like, epic fail the day before. Or 3 days before, I beg your pardon. So you read this ending and you think, this is just not very impressive. If you were going to finish the account of the life of Jesus, and you believe him to be, the most significant figure in history, and you've started to follow him, and you've given your life to him, you would want to write a better ending, I think. I certainly would. But Mark has written this ending, partly because it's what's happened, but also because there is something super interesting about what is going on in the previous 15 chapters. And so please strap in. I'm going to do an overview of Mark's gospel, the whole book, right now, in the next few minutes. I promise it'll be short. And we're going to see something in the lead up to what we've read here, which leaves us with a really interesting couple of questions. Okay, so perhaps the slide could show, if we've got that picture, does the picture exist? All right, you're going to see now the whole of Mark's gospel on the screen. Can you read it? You can read at least the stuff that's not in 1-point font. This is the entire text of Mark's gospel as far as chapter 15, verse 39. Now, if you've never read Mark, don't worry. I'm not expecting you to read that. I do want you to see the words that are visible, Because what Mark's done is he's written a book with a really, really clear structure. This isn't like an academic lecture. Please don't think, oh no, like academic, boring professorial lecture. This is just to show you that Mark has written something with a really deliberate, symmetrical structure. Now, if anybody here is into literature, and I know there's at least one person, you'll know that the way that you structure a book is important. It's not random. So what I've done is I have shown you the whole gospel from chapter 1, verse 1 to chapter 15, verse 39, and you will see that the resurrection account, which is not included there, is kind of a PS. It's kind of an epilogue. It's like, oh, and by the way, Jesus rose from the dead. So the anticlimax and the kind of unresolved stuff in the verses, those 8 verses that we read, are really deliberate because Mark wants you to focus not on the resurrection, but on the stuff that comes before the resurrection in those bits there. Now, the way I'm going to do it is just to show you that Mark has written a book in 2 halves. Okay, that's all you need to know about Mark's gospel. And you can see the 2 halves there. And you've got chapter 1, verse 1, which is the introduction, and he says what this gospel is going to be about. This is a gospel about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And you sit there and you think, well, yeah, we kind of knew that. That's not particularly helpful information until you see that what Mark has done is he's told you the 2 things he's going to tell you about. He's told you that in these 15 chapters coming up, I'm going to tell you what it means for Jesus to be Christ. And then I'm going to tell you what it means for Jesus to be Son of God. And the way that comes out in this book is, look at the next headings. Right in the middle of the book, chapter 8, verse 29, Jesus is talking to the disciples, and he says, who do you say I am? And Peter says, you are the Christ. That's part 1. See chapter 1, verse 1. This is about Jesus Christ. And then chapter 8, verse 29, Peter gets it. You are the Christ. I wish I had more time to talk to you about what happens after Peter gets that kind of thumbs up. Yep, you're the Christ. He really messes up in the very next verse. But we're not going to look at it now. But at least he's understood that Jesus is the Christ. Now, what does that mean? What does that even mean? Those tiny words that you can't see, about 4,500 words in our English translation, and it's basically Mark teaching you what it means for Jesus to be Christ. And in a word, it means he's king. He's Lord. He's God's chosen ruler. And in one way or another, that first teeny tiny block of text is showing you what it means for Jesus to be king. And it's interesting, and it's challenging, and it's shocking, and it's surprising in different ways. We're not going to look at examples, but you can dig in and you can start to see how Mark is showing you that Jesus is not quite the kind of king that you thought he was going to be. He's come to do something slightly different from what you thought he's going to come, what you thought he came to do. He's going to do it in a different way and with different results and different outcomes. But big story, Jesus is Christ, which means that Jesus is king. Now, at the very least, that means that you're sitting here now listening to the words of someone who is claiming authority. He's not just bringing information. He's not just trying to change your worldview. He's not just offering you an option. He's actually saying, listen, I've got absolute authority over everything. Everything. You know, the whole of London. Every part of your life. Every day of your week. Every building you go into. Every hobby that you follow. Every relationship that you have. All of these things sit under the authority of someone who in these 8 chapters is shown to be king. Authority. I don't know what you're like, but most of us, most people, are the kind of people who don't want that kind of authority. We just don't want it. We'd rather sort things out ourselves, thank you very much. We'd rather make our own decisions. We'd rather choose our own priorities. But here's someone who's saying, just forget all that stuff. Your priorities come under these priorities. And that affects all kinds of things. Even stuff that we were talking about as Malcolm was interviewing me. Where do you live in the world? Who do you speak to? What places do you go to? What's important? What do you spend your money on? What's important for your kids if you have a family? What's important for your marriage if you're married to someone? What's important for your parents as they get older? What's important for your heart's desires? All of those things come under this title. You're the Christ. And that means, again, at the very least, that as we walk out of this building, we can't really be exactly the same as we were when we came in. And communion kind of signals that, doesn't it? Taking part in the Lord's Supper kind of agrees with that idea that we're joining in this thing that is instituted by this king. He makes the choices, and our choices come under that. The second half of Mark's gospel is about the second point that Mark introduces in verse 1, Son of God. Now, I don't have time to show this, but when it says there, Son of God, it isn't just kind of like his family relationship, like, God the Father, God the Son. It's not just that. It's actually much more specific. And it's actually, when you look into the background information that comes out of the Old Testament, this is a description of Jesus, not just as a king, but as a particular kind of king. And I wonder if you can tell what kind of king from the final heading. Okay, so we've looked at that first block of tiny text. Jesus is Christ. Peter gets it. In that second block of text, we find out what it means for Jesus to be Son of God. And how do we know that? Well, it closes with chapter 15, verse 39. If you want to see that in your own Bible, you can see it. The centurion, the guy who's been part of the execution squad, is the one who looks at Jesus and sees how he dies and gets the second thing, Son of God. Surely this man was the Son of God, because he sees that in this way Jesus breathes his last. Now, I don't know if you've ever read that verse before, but for decades, like literally decades, I'd read it and think, oh, okay, well, Jesus died, and then the guy says he's the Son of God. Fine. But look, this is Mark showing you that if you see how Jesus dies, then you will be able to understand what it means for him to be the Son of God. And as I said, I'm not going to go into all the details, but the key thing here is that you see that Jesus is the Son of God when you see how he dies. And that means that what Mark is showing you is that Jesus isn't just a king, the Christ, but he's a king who dies. And that we have to follow a king like that in that way. So to be a disciple means to follow this kind of king. To live in London as a Christian means living in London under this kind of king who asks us to follow him in this kind of way. That sacrifice, that priorities, that suffering, that hardship are going to be part and parcel of following Jesus. It's not a great sales pitch. It is not a great sales pitch, except that it actually is. Because at the end, there's glory. It comes after. Right now, you follow Jesus, you make tough choices to follow him. You give up things. You have to. That's just part of the deal. But it's worth it, because in the end, there's glory. And that's the pattern through this book. Follow me now, and that means follow me and die. But afterwards, there's everything. But that's the right order. Follow me and die now, join me in glory later. And that's the pattern of this book. That is the Gospel of Mark, the good news about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Follow this king now and receive glory later. And if you can just remember sort of visually what this looks like, that will help you, because it's these two halves. And it's almost exactly the same number of words in both halves. 4,500 words in part 1, 4,500 words in part 2. Mark has written it deliberately to show this. And you might sit there and think, okay, so what? Well, as I've said, there's at least a couple of things to pick up on. Our life is under a king. We're under an authority. We're not our own masters. Even if you feel like you are, or if you feel like you want to be, the reality is that you are not, and I'm not. There's a king over everything. And the second thing is that he is a king who invites us to follow him in the way that he went, which is suffering and death now, and glory later. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is Mark's gospel. All of it. But not quite all of it. Because we've got this weird resurrection account at the end. And what do you do with that? Because it's become really, really clear to me over the last couple of years. I read Mark's gospel with students all the time in Athens. It's become a bit of a joke because it's like Jonathan only knows one book of the Bible. But it doesn't matter because it's not boring. I do know the bits of the Bible, but this has been the most fun part recently. And over the last couple of years, digging into it deeper and deeper with students, they've helped me slowly to see that this actually really matters. This structure really matters because Mark is telling you that what you need to really focus on are these two things, that he's the Christ and that he's the Son of God. But then you read the end and you think, okay, what does that mean? What's the resurrection bit got to do with that? Because it is almost like, oh, and by the way, Jesus rose from the dead, and it wasn't that impressive. Like, Jesus isn't even there in those verses. Did you notice that? So you read a resurrection account, and you'd think, well, it'd be kind of good if the central character turned up. But he doesn't. And I'm just thinking, why is that? Why has Mark done this? And then just a few months ago, the pieces started to fit together a bit more clearly. And because of this structure, and because of this chapter 1, chapter 8, chapter 15 thing, and then, oh, and by the way, the resurrection, we started to realize that what Mark is doing is he's saying to you at least three things. He's saying, this story is not complete. This book is like an open-ended book because it's going to continue. The story continues. Like, there's more to come. You're going to meet Jesus. He turns up later. Not in this book, not in these pages, but he will be around later. This is an unfinished story, and that's true, isn't it? Like, what is it now? 2024, I think Malcolm said? It is 2024, isn't it? It gets a bit confusing these days. But it's still going. You're sitting here now, know it or not, because of what happened 2,000 years ago. The story continues. It's an open-ended story. And it's like an invitation, this chapter 16 weird ending, is like an invitation for you to kind of get into that story, to read it, to be part of it, to see how it ends, to see the future, to see what lies ahead. We're not sitting here thinking about something that's finished, but we're sitting here thinking about something that's happening now and will continue to happen. And that's super exciting. I think reading Lord of the Rings and wanting Tolkien to keep writing, even though he's already written a fat book, is evidence that when you're in a good story, you want it to keep going. And that's what the resurrection says. The story is not over. And if you're here as someone kind of on the outside, thinking about it, skeptical, questioning, whatever, that's the kind of story that you're being invited to look at. Something that actually happens now. Not just dead, dry, finished history, but continuing history that's still being written and has a fantastic ending. That's still to come. The second thing that I think this unfinished story kind of invites you to look at is that this is a story for people who fail. Don't you get that kind of flavor? Like I said before, the guys aren't even there. I mean, they have all messed up. I don't know where they are, hiding in their houses, back fishing, not sure, but they're not where they should be. And the angel says to the women, get the guys back, go and tell them. So the 10 disciples, Judas is out of the picture, but the 10 disciples are nowhere to be seen. And Peter has disqualified himself, even from being called a disciple, so that Jesus has to kind of add him on at the end. The angel has to add him on at the end. Tell the disciples, oh yeah, and Peter, even Peter, still has a place in this story. And then the women don't obey. They went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Don't you read this and think, like, we're not the only failures. The guys are invisible and the women are frightened. And you think about your own life and your own failings and your own mistakes, and don't you feel just like a welcome, like an extension of the invitation to you? You know, you too, Jonathan Clark, you have also failed. You too, Trinity Central, have also failed. The gospel is for people like you. The gospel is not for people who've got it sorted. It's not for people who don't make mistakes. Not for people who've sorted their mess out first and then come to the communion table, but who come with the mistakes, with the baggage, with the failure. And I read that and I just think, what a relief. This is not someone saying to me, Jonathan, clean yourself up and get involved. This is someone saying, Jonathan, come, because you can't clean yourself up. And I still invite you to get involved. It's just brilliant. And the word at the beginning, the gospel, you know what it means, I hope. It comes from a Greek word. Well, not gospel, but evangelion, the good news. It's good news, not because it's God saying, sort yourself out, but because through these two things of seeing that Jesus is the King and Jesus is the King who suffers and dies, you are given good news. You are given the invitation. We are given the inclusion, even though we're so messed up. And I just want to be honest about that, and I hope that you can be honest about that as well. Don't sit here thinking, I'm all right. We know you're not. God knows you're not. Mark knows you're not. Peter knows you're not. And they're writing a book about good news for people like us who fail, people who are frightened, people who disappear, people who opt out, people who mess up, people who need that weekly reminder of the communion message. The body of Jesus broken for you, the blood of Jesus shed for you. And like I said, I don't know what you're like, but it is an absolutely universal trait of human beings that we just want to be better than we are. We want to pretend that we're better than we are. We want to make ourselves better than we are, and then try and please God. It doesn't work. He offers good news for people like us, for people like them who fail, and the resurrection account here shows that. So there's a couple of things. This is an unfinished story, and it's a story for people who fail. But thirdly, and this is what we're going to close with, and this is the thing that I think has become most interesting to me over the last 3 or 4 months, is that this is a story that sends you back to the beginning. So the way that it works, I think, very deliberately, Mark's saying, look, here's all the stuff I want to teach you about Jesus being the Christ, and Jesus being the Christ who suffers and dies. Oh, and by the way, he's raised again, which leaves you with all these questions. So what are you going to do about it? Are you just going to kind of stop at verse 8 and think, oh, well, that's not very good? No. Learn how the book works and realize that this is an invitation to go back to the beginning. So you know how a piece of music sometimes has the da capo thing which sends you back to the beginning of the phrase? Something like that. If you can read music, you know what I'm talking about. That kind of, here's the phrase finished, go back to the beginning of the phrase and repeat it. And I think the resurrection in Mark is doing that. It's saying to you, the story's not finished. Where are you going to go when you realize that you're frightened? When you realize that you've messed up? When you realize that you don't really get it? When you realize that you've opted out? What are you going to do? Well, in this book, go back 15 chapters and start again. And what happens when you start again is that you read it again and you go a bit deeper. And you see new connections. And you get more light. And you see more of the amazement of the gospel. I promise you that's what happens when you go back. And you go back and you go back. Because every time you go deeper and deeper and deeper. It's a little bit like reading We're Going on a Bear Hunt, We're Going to Catch a Big One, which is not a complicated book. It's not got many words. My kids learned it off by heart when they were 18 months old. And seeing new things like a new bit of the picture, or a new expression on one of the kids' faces, or a new source of terror as you find the bear. And you do it again and again and again, and you never end, because there's always something new to see. Except with the Bible, like for example with Mark's Gospel, there literally is always something new to see. I'll give you one example from today. As it was being read, I saw a word in the passage and thought, oh, I hadn't thought about that before. Got to go back and do a bit more work on that. If you're interested to know what it was the white robe. Spoiler for another conversation. There's stuff here that you just don't notice the first time round, or the 10th time round, or the 100th time round. Because Jesus is inviting you to go back to the beginning and read the gospel, which is the good news about this Jesus. And as you do that, what do you actually see? What do you actually get as you go back to the beginning, having read this confusing or unimpressive or incomplete resurrection ending? What do you get? Well, basically you get what I've already said, an invitation to receive God himself, to receive his kindness and his patience and his forgiveness and his love, to receive that at a deeper and brighter and more amazing and more impressive level, because you go deeper and deeper into the story. And I just can't overstate how fantastic that is and how wonderful that is and how much it makes it worth the dying part, how much it makes it worth the suffering part. The invitation to follow Jesus is an invitation to take up your cross and die. But when you see how great it is, you understand more and more how worthwhile it is. So we've got to finish there because I've taken my time, but I just want to say that without knowing any of your situations, well, I know a little bit of Malcolm and Karis's because I've talked to them today. I don't know any of your situations. I have no idea what you're thinking, what you're feeling, what you're looking forward to tomorrow, what you're worried about tomorrow, what you did yesterday, where you've come from. But this is an invitation to you to receive that good news again, to receive grace, to receive kindness again. And I'm going to finish with one phrase that you won't have picked up on yet because it's in the tiny text. But the very next words after the title there, the beginning of the gospel about Jesus Christ, Son of God, the very next words are, as it's written in the prophets. Now, I don't know what that does to you. You might be like, oh man, not that. All that Old Testament stuff, the prophets. Well, let me tell you that the prophets in question are going to tell you two things straight away in the very next words. One is, there's judgment coming. And the next is, but there's rescue from that judgment. Those are the very next things in Mark's gospel. So if you're like, big deal, what is all this about? Friends, it is a really big deal. Because Mark goes on to say there's judgment coming. But don't worry, because there's rescue from that judgment. Read on to find out how the king rescues you from that judgment. Read on to find out where that comfort lies. Read on to work out how the gospel actually works. And it is such good news. That's why it's worth sitting here for an hour on a Sunday morning. It's why it's worth living under the lordship, under the authority of a king like that. And it's why it's worth dying and facing glory later. And the resurrection says all of that and much more. We must finish. I think I'll probably close with a prayer. If you want to pick up on any of this afterwards, I know that we've just done a whole book in 25 minutes, so that's a preposterous idea. So if you want to follow up on any of it afterwards, I'll be around. I'm not rushing off. This church is probably a great place to dig in deeper and to get into these kinds of things and find out what's in that tiny font and find out why the gospel is as good as it is and why it's worth following Jesus the way that he asks us to. Let me pray for us. Lord Jesus, thank you that you have shown us in this book about you that you came to do something so good. We thank you for the good news. We thank you that it is actually good. We thank you that it's better than we thought it was. I pray that you would help us as a result of being together this morning, as a result of being part of this church, that you would help us to see more and more of your goodness, to see more and more of how good the good news really is. And we thank you that you rose from the dead. We thank you that that invites us to follow you and to go deeper and deeper into this story. Please bless this church family. Help them to be part of this city, to have open arms and open hearts and open doors to people in this city. And we pray this so that you would be known and so that we would be helped. In your name, amen.